My name is Ethan, and I've always thought of myself as an ordinary guy in a world that rarely stops to notice people like me. I'm 24, just out of college, working long shifts at a mid-sized IT firm in Seattle. Most days blur together. Wake up too early, squeeze onto a crowded bus, stare at screens until my eyes sting, then drag myself home to a small apartment that smells faintly of coffee grounds and detergent. On paper, my life is fine. Stable, even. But lately, when I catch my reflection in the darkened glass of the office lobby at night, I don't see someone living, I see someone waiting. Though I'm not sure for what. I rent a one-bedroom on the fourth floor of an aging brick building. The walls are thin, and I can hear my neighbor's television late at night, the laugh track echoing through plaster. Sometimes I mute my own phone just to sit in the quiet, but the silence has weight to it. The fridge hums, the pipes groan, and that becomes the soundtrack of evenings spent alone. I tell myself I should be grateful. I'm young, I'm healthy, I have a steady paycheck. Yet the truth is, there's an ache under everything, like a thread pulling loose in a sweater. Friends drift in and out of my days. The closest one is Ryan, who I've known since high school. We don't see each other as much as we used to, but when we do, it feels like old times banter about video games, late night burgers, small comforts. He's the type who carries warmth wherever he goes, the kind of guy people notice. Standing next to him, I've often felt like a shadow, someone slightly out of focus. Still, he's been a constant in my life when so much else has shifted. Through Ryan, I knew his mom, Mrs. Callahan. Or at least, I thought I knew her. She was the figure who floated at the edge of our teenage hangouts, offering pizza rolls or reminding Ryan not to stay out too late. To us, she was just the mom, hovering somewhere between authority and background noise. I never really looked at her beyond that. She was older, elegant in a way that didn't need attention. Her hair always tied back neatly, her voice calm, measured. I guess back then I filed her away in my mind as someone solid, predictable like the steady glow of a porch light you take for granted until it flickers. Work has been relentless lately, projects piling up faster than I can check them off. My manager praises efficiency but not creativity, and every day feels like moving numbers from one column to another. Sometimes when I catch the afternoon light slanting across my desk, I imagine just walking out, disappearing into a city that wouldn't notice if I stopped showing up. But I don't. I keep my head down. I answer emails, I go home. That's the rhythm. Safe. Empty. I suppose that's why I noticed my own restlessness more sharply. Little things started to stand out. The way families laughed together on the bus. The sight of couples lingering outside coffee shops even in the drizzle. It wasn't envy exactly, but a recognition of something missing. I could fill hours with work and noise, but not the quiet moments of being seen, of being understood. I told myself it didn't matter, that maybe this was just the shape of adulthood. Still, when the night stretched too long, I wondered if I'd already let something slip past me without realizing. Looking back now, I see the irony. The story I'm about to tell didn't begin with anything extraordinary. It began with a borrowed jacket, something so small, so ordinary it should have been forgettable. But nothing about what followed was forgettable. That jacket became the hinge on which everything turned. Friendship, family, loneliness, desire. I didn't know it then, but when I carried it back to her front door, my life was about to veer into a space I'd never imagined, one filled with questions I still don't have all the answers to. It was a Tuesday night when I realized I still had Ryan's jacket. We'd met up a few nights earlier to watch a game at a bar near campus, and when the rain started pouring afterward, he'd tossed it over my shoulders as we ran to catch the bus. I'd forgotten to give it back, and the jacket had been sitting draped over a chair in my apartment since. It wasn't much, a faded navy windbreaker, but it carried the faint smell of someone else's laundry detergent, a reminder that I needed to return it before too much time passed. The day at work had stretched me thin. I left the office later than I wanted, the sky already dimming to that slate-gray Seattle wears so often in November. My bus route took me close enough to Ryan's place that I decided I might as well drop it off. I hadn't called ahead. I figured I'd just hand it to him quickly and go. My head was full of unfinished code, overdue tasks, and the familiar dullness of another day gone. The idea of making small talk wasn't appealing. but I told myself it would be quick. The Callahans lived in a quiet neighborhood lined with maple trees that had already shed most of their leaves. Their house sat on a corner lot, light glowing softly from the kitchen window. I remember pausing at the end of the walkway, jacket folded over my arm, suddenly conscious of how unplanned this was. But I shook the feeling off and rang the doorbell. It wasn't Ryan who answered. The door opened, and there she was, Mrs. Callahan. I hadn't seen her in months, maybe longer, and something about that moment jolted me. She looked different than I remembered, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. She wore a pale cardigan wrapped around her shoulders, her hair down instead of tied back. The light from the hallway framed her in a way that softened everything, made her seem both familiar and strangely new. "Ethan," she said, her voice carrying a mix of surprise and warmth. "What are you doing here?" I held up the jacket awkwardly. "Just returning this. Ryan left it with me the other night." Her smile was small, almost private, as she stepped aside. "He's not here, actually. Went out with some friends. But come in, you can leave it inside." For a second, I considered making an excuse, handing it off quickly and leaving. But the air outside had that damp chill, and the glow spilling from their living room looked too inviting. I stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind me. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and something baking, a comfort I hadn't realized I missed until that instant. We walked into the living room, where the TV hummed softly in the background. She placed the jacket on a chair and then turned to me with that same gentle smile. "You look tired. Long day?" "Always," I said, trying to laugh it off. But my voice carried more honesty than I intended. She studied me for a moment, her expression unreadable, then motioned toward the kitchen. "I just made tea. Would you like some?" "It might help," I hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, thank you." The kitchen was warm, the kettle still steaming on the counter. She poured 2 cups, sliding one toward me across the table. I wrapped my hands around it, grateful for the heat. We sat across from each other, the silence not uncomfortable but weighted, like there was something unspoken hovering between us. It struck me then how little I really knew her. For years, she had been the mother who reminded Ryan to do his homework, who asked if I wanted more pizza, who existed on the periphery of our teenage world. But sitting there across from her now, I noticed details I hadn't before. The way her fingers curved delicately around the cup, the faint laugh lines near her eyes, the way she carried herself with quiet composure. "You've grown up," she said suddenly, her gaze steady. I felt my face flush. "I guess so. Doesn't feel like it most days?" Her lips curved in a small smile, tinged with something that felt almost wistful. "It never really does. Adulthood sneaks up on you, and suddenly you're carrying all these things you didn't ask for." Her words landed heavier than I expected, as if she wasn't just speaking generally, but from her own weight of experience. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but instead I sipped my tea, letting the warmth settle inside me. The conversation drifted to safer topics: work, how Ryan was doing, little updates about life. Yet beneath it all, there was an undercurrent I couldn't quite name. Every so often, our eyes would meet across the table, and I felt a flicker of something. Connection, maybe, or curiosity. It wasn't overt, but it was there, lingering in the pauses between words. At one point, the phone rang in the living room. She excused herself, and I sat listening as her voice carried faintly down the hall. It was brief, just a reminder call from a neighbor, but the interruption made me notice how quiet the house was otherwise. No footsteps upstairs, no clatter of dishes, just her presence, and mine. When she returned, she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and gave me an apologetic smile. "Sorry about that. These evenings get quiet sometimes?" I nodded, understanding more than I could explain. My own nights were filled with that same quiet, heavy with what was missing. We finished our tea, and though the visit had stretched longer than I planned, I didn't feel the urge to leave. The atmosphere was oddly soothing, the kind of calm I rarely found anywhere else. Yet beneath it all, there was tension too, like a thread pulling taut between us, waiting for one of us to acknowledge it. When I finally stood to go, she walked me to the door. The porch light flickered overhead, and for a moment, I thought she might say something more, something that would break the fragile line we'd both been towing. but instead she just said softly, "Good night, Ethan." I stepped out into the cool air, the sound of the door closing behind me, lingering longer than it should have. Walking back down the quiet street, I felt unsettled, not in a bad way, but as if something had shifted. A borrowed jacket had brought me there, but it wasn't the jacket I was thinking about anymore. It was her, the way her eyes had met mine, the way her words had carried weight, the quiet of the house and the warmth of her tea. Something had begun, though I couldn't yet name it. I didn't expect to see her again so soon. A week passed, and Ryan and I barely crossed paths. He was busy with his own world grad school classes, new friends, a girlfriend I'd only heard about in passing. I didn't want to be the guy who clung to someone else's life to fill the gaps in my own. Yet, on a Saturday morning when the sky was a rare, clear blue, I found myself walking past their street on my way back from the store. I don't know if it was habit or curiosity or something deeper pulling me there. Her car was in the driveway, the hood propped open. She was leaning over, peering at the engine with an expression of mild frustration. I slowed my steps, then stopped altogether. She noticed me almost immediately, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Ethan," she called, sounding both surprised and relieved. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about cars, would you?" I laughed, setting down the grocery bag in my hand. "A little." "What's going on?" She stepped aside so I could take a look. The problem was minor, just a loose battery connection, but the way she stood beside me, watching, made it feel like more. Our shoulders brushed once when she leaned closer, and though it was nothing intentional, the spark of contact lingered. When the car started again, her relief spilled into a smile that reached her eyes. "You're a lifesaver." I'd have been stuck all day. "It was nothing," I said, but the way she looked at me made it feel like something. She invited me in for coffee as thanks, and I accepted before I had time to second guess. That morning stretched into an afternoon of conversation at her kitchen table. She told me about her work at a local nonprofit, her love of books, her quiet routines. And in turn, I found myself telling her things I hadn't told anyone in a long time about my frustrations at work, the way I felt stuck between being young and already old, my fear of drifting through life unnoticed. She listened without interruption, her gaze steady and soft, and I realized how rare that was. Most people wait for their turn to speak. She actually heard me. Over the next few weeks, our paths crossed more often. Sometimes it was by chance, sometimes less so. She'd call me when she needed help carrying groceries in from the car. I'd find excuses to check in, asking if she needed anything from the store when I was heading out. We began sharing small rituals, morning coffee if I stopped by on weekends, a short walk around the neighborhood when the rain let up. It was during those walks that the conversations deepened. One evening, under the glow of a street lamp, she admitted, almost offhand, that nights had grown lonelier since Ryan spent less time at home. "The house feels too big sometimes," she said quietly, her breath forming clouds in the cool air. I wanted to say something that would fill that space for her, but all I managed was, "I know the feeling." She glanced at me then, her eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite name: recognition. Maybe, or gratitude? That moment hung between us, delicate and unspoken. There were lighter moments, too. One Saturday, I offered to cook dinner at her place. I wasn't much of a chef, but I managed pasta and garlic bread. She laughed at my clumsy attempts to dice onions, stepping in to show me how. Her hand brushed mine when she guided the knife, and I felt a rush of warmth climb my neck. We ate at her small dining table, the flicker of candles she'd lit casting soft shadows across the room. It wasn't a date, not really, but it wasn't not a date either. Afterward, she insisted on washing the dishes while I dried them. At one point, she paused, holding a dripping plate in her hands, and said, "It's nice, you know, having someone around." The simplicity of her words made my chest tighten. I wanted to tell her how much it meant to me, too, but instead I just nodded, afraid of breaking whatever fragile thing we were building. She began to open up more, bit by bit. One rainy evening, as we sat in the living room with mugs of tea, she told me about her divorce years ago, how she'd tried to hold everything together for Ryan's sake, how she'd quietly set aside her own wants. "I don't regret it," she said softly, "but sometimes I wonder what I gave up without even realizing." Her voice carried a tremor I'd never heard before. I wanted to reach out, to place my hand over hers, but I stopped myself. Instead, I met her gaze and said, "You deserved more than just holding it all together." She blinked, her eyes shining, and for a moment the silence between us was thick with everything we weren't saying. Of course, there were risks. I felt them pressing in from the edges of our closeness. The thought of Ryan finding out, of people whispering, of lines being crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Sometimes walking back to my apartment after leaving her house, I'd wrestle with the knot of emotions inside me, wanting her, respecting her, fearing the consequences. But every time I found myself going back anyway. The connection between us wasn't about grand gestures or declarations. It was in the small things. The way she saved me a portion of her favorite pie, the way she noticed when I was quieter than usual, the way her hand lingered a second longer when she passed me a cup of coffee. These little moments stitched themselves together into something undeniable. And yet it still felt fragile, like a secret world existing just between us. One look, one word out of place, and it could all unravel. But for the first time in a long while, the emptiness I carried felt less heavy. Because when I was with her, I wasn't waiting anymore. I was living, if only in those stolen hours. The turning point came on a night I hadn't planned for. It was late December, the kind of evening when the air felt brittle and sharp, when the city lights looked hazy through the frost gathering on windshields. I'd gone to visit her after a long day, not expecting anything more than the quiet comfort we'd slowly grown used to tea in the kitchen. Maybe a walk if the rain held off. But storms don't always come with warning. Sometimes they rise right there in the room, out of silence, out of all the things left unsaid. She'd been quieter than usual that evening. I noticed it right away, the way she moved through the kitchen without the usual grace, her hands fidgeting as she poured hot water into the teapot. I asked if something was wrong, and she gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's just been a long day," she said, but her voice betrayed something heavier. We sat across from each other at the small table, the steam from our cups swirling between us like smoke. Outside, the wind rattled the branches against the window. Inside, it was too quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I watched her fingers tap against the ceramic, restless, and I felt the weight of a question pressing at the back of my throat. Finally, I asked, "Do you ever feel like you're carrying too much alone?" She looked up sharply, and for a moment, I thought she might deflect. But then her expression softened, and she let out a laugh that sounded more like a sob. "All the time," she whispered, "but it's easier not to say it out loud." Her vulnerability cracked something open in me. I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. She froze, her eyes flicking to our joined hands, then back to me. For a moment, the room was charged, my heart beat loud in my ears. I wanted to pull back, to apologize, but I couldn't. Because for once, silence wasn't enough. Her hand trembled under mine, but she didn't move it away. "Ethan?" she said softly, almost warning, almost pleading. I swallowed hard. "I don't know what I'm doing. I just know that being here with you feels different. Feels right, somehow." The air between us thickened, words heavy with everything we hadn't dared to say. She stood abruptly, moving to the sink, her back to me. I sat frozen, watching her shoulders rise and fall with each shaky breath. For a long moment, I thought she might ask me to leave, but when she turned back, her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You're too young to understand what you're risking," she said, her voice trembling. "If Ryan knew, if anyone knew." Her words cut through me, sharp and true. The reality of it all pressed down. The friendship I'd shared with her son, the whispers that would follow, the line we'd cross that couldn't be uncrossed. But beneath that fear was something undeniable. An ache that had been building for weeks, maybe months, waiting for this very moment. "I do understand," I said quietly. "I've thought about all of it. But none of it matters when I'm here, not compared to how I feel." She shook her head, a bitter laugh slipping out. "You shouldn't say things like that." "But it's the truth," I insisted. The silence that followed felt like a storm breaking. I stood, crossing the small space between us. She didn't step back, though her whole body seemed to tremble. I could feel the heat radiating from her, the scent of her skin, the closeness that had been both a comfort and a torment for so long. Her eyes met mine then, and for the first time there was no mask, no careful restraint. only longing, she whispered, barely audible. Don't leave me alone tonight. Those words shattered every barrier left between us. My breath caught, and before I could think, I pulled her into my arms. She clung to me with a desperation that startled us both, her fingers digging into my back. The world outside ceased to exist. The storm, the rules, the consequences. There was only her heartbeat pressed against mine, only the heat of her body, only the truth we could no longer hide. Time blurred. We didn't rush, but we didn't hesitate either. Every touch was hesitant yet certain, every glance a confession. At one point, she pulled away just enough to look at me, her face inches from mine. We can't go back after this, she whispered. I don't want to, I answered. And it was true. The point of no return had already passed. Later, when we finally sat side by side on the couch, the weight of what had happened settled around us like the fading storm outside. She leaned her head against my shoulder, her breathing steadying, though her hand still gripped mine tightly. I stared at the window, watching the rain streak down, feeling the enormity of it all pressing in. The consequences were already there, shadows in the corners of the room. Ryan, the neighbors, the unspoken rules of how the world would see us. And yet I couldn't summon regret, only a strange, fragile peace that we had finally stopped pretending. Still, the questions gnawed at me. What would happen when the morning came, when the fragile bubble of this night burst under the harshness of daylight? I didn't know. But as she whispered my name against the quiet, her voice raw and tender, I realized that some moments demand surrender, no matter the cost. That night changed everything. The borrowed jacket had been the beginning, but this was the breaking point, the place where two lives collided in a way that could never be undone. And as much as fear curled in my chest, I knew I wouldn't trade it for anything. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting anymore. I was here fully, dangerously, achingly alive. Morning light always tells the truth. It slipped through the curtains in pale gold streaks, brushing across the living room where we had drifted to sleep. I woke first, disoriented, the weight of her head resting gently on my shoulder. For a moment, I just listened to the soft rhythm of her breathing, to the silence of the house that felt no longer empty, but full. Almost sacred. Then the realization returned, sharp and undeniable. What we had crossed into couldn't be erased. She stirred soon after, her lashes fluttering open, and when her eyes met mine, there was a vulnerability there that I hadn't seen before. Not fear exactly, but awareness. She pulled back slightly, sitting upright, her hands twisting together in her lap. The space between us felt suddenly fragile, delicate as glass. Ethan? She said softly, her voice hoarse from sleep. Last night, we can't pretend it didn't happen. But we also can't pretend it's simple. I nodded, my throat tight. I know. She exhaled slowly, as though she'd been holding her breath for years. I don't regret it. That's the part that scares me. Her honesty steadied me. I reached for her hand, hesitant, but when she didn't pull away, I let my fingers close gently around hers. Neither do I said. And maybe it doesn't have to be simple to be real. We sat there in silence, letting those words settle. The world outside was already stirring, cars starting, children's voices carrying faintly down the street. Reality waited just beyond the walls. But inside, in that moment, there was a fragile peace. Later, in the kitchen, I made us coffee. The small act felt symbolic, grounding. She smiled faintly when I slid the mug toward her, brushing my hand as she took it. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, but it was ours. We didn't talk much about the future that day. Instead, we stayed close, letting gestures carry what words couldn't. She found an old photo album tucked on a shelf, and we leafed through it together. Pictures of Ryan as a child, birthdays, holidays. She lingered on a photo of the three of us from high school, Ryan grinning, me awkward with too long hair, and her in the background, blurred but still unmistakably her. She touched the edge of the photo with a wistful smile. Life circles back on itself in strange ways, she murmured. That evening, before I left, she pressed something into my hand. A small silver key. For when it's late and you don't want to be alone, she said quietly. My chest tightened at the weight of it, both literal and symbolic. In the days that followed, we found a rhythm again, though it carried new undercurrents. She'd call me to help with errands, and I'd linger longer than necessary. We shared dinners that stretched into hours, walks that looped farther than we planned. It wasn't the reckless passion of the night we'd crossed the line. It was something steadier, quieter. A bond that felt less like fire and more like warmth you didn't want to lose. Of course, shadows still hovered. When I met Ryan for lunch one afternoon, guilt pressed against me like a stone. He spoke casually about his classes, his girlfriend, his plans. I nodded, smiled where I needed to, all while hearing his mother's voice in my memory. "Don't leave me alone tonight." The dissonance was almost unbearable, but when I returned to her later that evening, she seemed to sense it. She touched my cheek gently, her eyes searching mine. "We'll figure this out," she whispered, "one step at a time." It wasn't a promise of perfection, but it was a promise of effort, of care. And that was enough for me. Transformation rarely comes with fanfare. It creeps in quietly, reshaping you through small acts. For me, it was her laugh resurfacing after weeks of silence. It was the way she trusted me with her stories late at night. It was the way I no longer dreaded my evenings alone because I knew I wasn't. Somewhere in those days, the emptiness that had once defined me began to soften. I wasn't just existing anymore. I was beginning to belong. Winter stretched into the pale beginnings of spring. The rain still fell most days, but sometimes the sun broke through, scattering light across wet sidewalks like fragments of glass. Life on the surface went on unchanged. Work errands, Ryan's occasional texts. Yet beneath it, something had shifted permanently, weaving itself into the quiet fabric of my days. One evening, I found myself at her house again, carrying takeout in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. She greeted me at the door with a tired but genuine smile, the kind that spoke more of trust than of politeness. We ate together at the small kitchen table, laughter spilling more easily than it had before, as though the weeks had smoothed the edges of fear. After dinner, she suggested a walk. The air was cool, the streets glistening after a recent rain. We didn't talk much at first, just moved side by side, our shoulders brushing now and then. When we reached the park at the end of the street, she stopped near the swings, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sky was streaked with fading pink and gold, the kind of sunset you almost miss if you're not paying attention. "Do you ever think about how life surprises you?" she asked quietly, her voice almost lost to the wind. "All the time," I admitted. She turned to look at me then, her eyes soft but searching. "I never imagined this." U.S. And yet, here we are. There was no need to answer. The truth of it hung between us, fragile but undeniable. I reached for her hand and she let me take it, her fingers tightening just slightly around mine. We stood there together, watching the sky darken. Two people bound not by expectation but by choice. By something that had grown in the quiet spaces neither of us had known how to fill. I knew questions still lingered. What Ryan would think, what others might say, how long we could keep this world just ours. But in that moment, the weight of the unknown didn't matter. What mattered was the warmth of her hand in mine, the way her shoulders relaxed when she leaned against me, the simple fact that neither of us was alone anymore. Later, as we walked back, the neighborhood lights flickering on one by one, I thought about the borrowed jacket that had started it all. Something so ordinary, so forgettable had led me here, to sunsets shared, to confessions whispered, to a connection I hadn't dared to hope for. When we reached her porch, she paused, looking at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, half gratitude, half longing, all human. She didn't speak, and neither did I. Instead, we let the silence hold us, heavy and tender. I don't know where the path leads from here. Maybe it winds into something lasting, maybe it burns out under the weight of reality. But what I do know is that it has already changed me, because in her presence I rediscovered something I thought I'd lost, the possibility of being seen, of being wanted, of belonging. And no matter what tomorrow brings, that will remain. If you've listened this far, maybe you understand why I had to tell this story. It wasn't about a jacket or even about crossing a line I never expected to cross. It was about the way a single moment can change everything, the way loneliness can open into connection when you least expect it, and how love, in its quietest form, can sneak into the corners of your life. I don't know what you believe about relationships, about timing, about what's right or wrong, but I know this. Sometimes the heart doesn't wait for permission. It just reaches out, trembling and afraid, and finds another hand willing to hold it. Maybe you felt that before, the shock of being seen, the fear of what comes next, the strange peace of realizing you're no longer alone. If you have it, then you know exactly why this story matters. So let me ask you, do you believe love can appear in the most unexpected places? In the people you never thought you'd need? If you do, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your story in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more whispered confessions, more moments that remind us just how human we are.